Protests in Hong Kong. Now that a controversial bill has been declared dead, what happens next? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Over the last few weeks, hundreds of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in Hong Kong. The demonstrations were sparked by opposition to the proposed legislation known as the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance that would allow for the extradition of criminal suspects to the Chinese mainland. And although the protests have largely been peaceful, earlier this month some protesters broke into the Legislative Council building and vandalized it. Meanwhile, this week Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, declared that the bill is now dead. The former British colony also recently marked the 22nd anniversary of its return to the Chinese mainland and the establishment of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. There is much to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining me now from Hong Kong is Andrew Leung. He is an international and independent China strategist. Also with us from Shanghai is Fred Teng. He is president of the America-China Public Affairs Institute. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. And also with me right here in the studio is CGTN White House Correspondent Nathan King. Welcome to all of you to the show. Nathan, let me start with you. We've seen these demonstrations now for weeks in Hong Kong. They were sparked by this controversy over this Fugitive Offenders Ordinance Bill, also known as the extradition bill. It basically allows for extraditions to the Chinese mainland. So give us some context here. Why have the protesters been so outspoken in their opposition to the bill?
Well, I think we need to go back a bit. I mean, the incentive for this bill was a rather grisly murder that happened in the region of Taiwan, where essentially the alleged perpetrator killed his girlfriend, and pretty nastily. I mean, put her in a suitcase and withdrew money from the ATM, and then sort of fled to Hong Kong. There were huge headlines all over China about this, and in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And essentially, this guy could not face murder charges. He could face money laundering charges because of the ATM withdrawal, but not anything else. And so that sort of sparked this move for this law. And what surprised me is that Hong Kong did not have an extradition treaty already with China or Taiwan, or they do have extradition agreements with others, including former colonies of the UK. But obviously what happened is the executive and the council really did underestimate the feeling in Hong Kong, and they have apologized since, not explaining the law, not talking more openly, not having wider consultations, and their messaging was terrible. I mean, if you looked into the details of the proposed law, there were so many different steps that something would have to go to before someone was extradited somewhere else, even to Beijing or somewhere else. There were so many different judicial steps that had to be going through, but this was so poorly explained by the Hong Kong government, and also the reaction was so swift and so fast that it caught them by control. But this is not just about this one law, is it? There's a real feeling of a disconnect between the population of Hong Kong and the people that rule them that stems really back to even pre-1997 handover. And I'm sure we'll get into it. You know, I'm sure our Chinese guests have much more nuance to say on it, but that's kind of setting it up for you.
All right, and just to be clear on something, Nathan, this law would cover a whole wide range of crimes in Hong Kong.
Right, but not serious crimes, ones that you can essentially get a lot of time in prison for. And in fact, it was amended to have even a higher threshold. There was some feeling, though, but it wasn't just about murder and bodily harm, but also some financial and corruption crimes were coming in. And that worried NGOs, that worried business community. And, you know, you can't get anything done in Hong Kong without the business community. And there was a feeling that Hong Kong's special financial status may have been under threat.
All right, let me go to Andrew Leung. He is in Hong Kong. Andrew, Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, she has now declared this bill dead. Let's listen to what she had to say.
There are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity, or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here There is no such plan. The bill is dead.
So, Andrew, the protesters are not happy with that. They want more. They want that bill to be formally withdrawn. But will this move by Carrie Lam be enough to scale back or perhaps end these protests?
Well, this is really, the bill is really the last straw on the camel's back, because it's not just about the bill itself. You can see the groundswell of dissatisfaction, of distrust, of concern, anxiety, that over the years, that the one country, two system has been tilting towards the one country rather than the two systems, or even sacrificing some of the values of the two systems. I mean, there are examples of perceived abduction of the booksellers in Hong Kong, disqualification of democratic legislators, and even the co-location arrangement whereby mainland law enforcement officers were allowed to operate in Hong Kong on the so-called joint checkpoint. And all this seems to be a slide towards the one country rather than safeguarding the values of the two systems. And then together with a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the young people, the lack of opportunities, upward mobility, the difficulties of starting their own families, of not being able to afford even a very tiny flat, the almost total despair, is all ignited by this single bill. So I think whatever she says is not likely to be accepted. But let's be fair, she already said that the bill is dead, and then the protesters still demand withdrawal. I mean, how are you going to withdraw something which is already dead? Right. But then also that there is no political mileage for even the pro-government legislators to support it, because they've lost a lot of their voters, their constituencies. Most of the constituencies object to this bill, and then the pro-government legislators are putting all their chips on this bill, and they're lost heavily. So there's no hope that they would even continue to support the government. So the bill is actually off the agenda. And then, of course, for the remainder of her term, however short, she's going to concentrate on livelihood issues. But then, of course, the protesters are having nothing of it. Then they still demand the bill to be formally withdrawn.
Okay, yeah, the protesters are asking for other things as well. But I want to go to Qinduo Xu. Qinduo, what do you make of those criticisms that the one country, two system plan is not working as it should, that this is drifting towards a one country, one system plan?
Well, interestingly, if you talk to people in the mainland, people would say there's too much stress about the two systems. People forget wholly about the one country. We belong to one country, Hong Kong and the mainland. And if you look at the responses or the performance of the central government, basically, they said a couple of times, they are with the Hong Kong chief executive. They are supporting the government. But nothing beyond that. It only have, yes, they have a quarrel disputes with the British government, because when it comes to foreign affairs and the defense of the territory, that's within the jurisdiction of the central government. Otherwise, it's all Hong Kong issues. Hong Kong government is running Hong Kong with a complete autonomy. And remember, this controversy, the extradition bill was initiated by the Hong Kong government. And yes, a poor job by the government to communicate with the public. And also, you would wonder whether there's an over-response to the extradition bill, because it's really touching upon 37 internationally recognized serious crimes. For those concerns, for example, political persecution, religious freedom, or press freedom, etc., like at least 8 instances, there were exceptions. Basically, anybody there's a concern about this, there's no extradition. And also, it will receive approval of the Hong Kong chief executive as well as the Court of Hong Kong. So there's a lot of safeguards. I would say 99.99% of those protesters, the bill have nothing to do with them. But somehow, this is a lightning rod for them. As the previous speaker pointed out, there's some frustration. For example, lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, lack of innovation in Hong Kong. There's a bigger problem potentially. I think that's really more important probably than the politics here.
All right, let me bring in Fred Teng. Fred, some see these protests as a rebuke of the relationship between the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong. The protesters have been asking for political reforms, for instance. They've also been asking for investigations into alleged police abuse. They've also been asking for Carrie Lam to step down, to resign from her position. What is your assessment of what has been happening in Hong Kong?
I was in Hong Kong during the first protest, and I was recently over there. And I can say that the police is really exercising utmost restraint. I've talked to a lot of police. They try not to arrest any of the young people because they do not want them to have a police record. Secondly is that if you can see, some of the police are using paintball guns. Those paintball guns is to pinpoint the people who's been attacking the police with bricks or with umbrellas they're throwing at the police. So they're not trying to arrest anyone who is just been protesting. I think that, certainly the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, have to take this route because she wants to protect Hong Kong as a whole in terms of its prosperity and its economy. Nobody wants to go to a city that's protesting all the time, and which including Paris. And so for Hong Kong's future and for Hong Kong's economy and its prosperity, Carrie Lam probably want to take this route. And then this bill, I think the process of this bill is that, but the extradition law is very much needed for all countries. And the extradition law is actually there to protect the suspect and not to hurt the suspect. There's other ways in terms of without the extradition law, there will be renditions or deportations. So there's a many different way of dealing with this matter, but the extradition law is probably the best way to deal with it in a legal matter.
So Nathan, here's an interesting point. If there is no extradition treaty between the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong, can criminals find a safe haven in Hong Kong?
I mean, this was one of the arguments that Carrie Lam and the executive pointed out.
Yeah.
That, Hong Kong's reputation could suffer. It could become, as you said, a haven for criminals and also corruption as well from the mainland, for example. There is no proof of that, but that was one of the main arguments. And there has been, in the past, the freewheeling sort of capitalism model in Hong Kong. My father used to do a lot of business in there. That is different from Chinese mainland and also other jurisdictions in Asia. And I think a lot of this is the fact that the protesters, young kids who may have economic worries, and millionaires and billionaires are on the same side on this suggests that they want to keep that status as well.
Of course, China resumed sovereignty over the former British colony, Hong Kong, 22 years ago. And then we had the introduction of the formula, which is one country, two systems. To what extent do these protests have to do with the fact that Hong Kong residents may feel that some of the rights that they were granted during that handover process, during those negotiations, they may be losing that now?
Well, I can tell you, I covered the negotiations in the UK with the handover. I have some personal connection to some Hong Kong residents, and it was really brutal, the negotiations. Just as the UK and China sort of agreed on a framework, there was a new governor, Chris Patten, for example. And remember, there was this huge argument back in the UK about granting Hong Kong residents citizenship rights in the UK passports. That was kind of sat on. In fact, very few Hong Kongers actually got that right. A lot of people went to Canada or got Canadian citizenship, New Zealand, Australia. And in a way, there was this sort of payoff, a bargain, where Chris Patten, the governor, and he had some opposition in the UK and in Hong Kong, tried to extend the franchise in order to sort of mitigate some of these criticisms. Yeah. And, when negotiations sort of fell down, essentially, China established a separate government in waiting, if you like, just across the border in Shenzhen because they didn't agree to it. So the mess was set, Right. And I think we're still living with the consequences of this. I'd love to hear from my Chinese colleagues about whether they agree, but sitting in London at the time, you could really feel those tensions, and I think they're still there today.
Andrew Leung, some of the protesters, as we reported at the beginning of our show, actually were involved in violence. They attacked the Legislative Council building at the beginning of July. This is how The Hong Kong Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, responded to that. Let's listen to this.
The second scene that we have seen, which really saddens a lot of people and shocks a lot of people, is the extreme use of violence and vandalism by protesters who stormed into the Legislative Council building over a period of time. So this is something that we should seriously condemn, because nothing is more important than the rule of law in Hong Kong.
So, Andrew, how much of a concern is that in Hong Kong, this concern over law and order? And how is this attack, this violence, how is it being viewed in the city?
Well, I think that most people in Hong Kong don't want this kind of violence. And of course, the business sector don't want it especially. And then even ordinary citizens, as they go about their businesses, are unlikely to view that with any kind of connivance. But on the other hand, the political parties, the opposition party, was just blaming all this violence on the government, on Carrie Lam, and said, well, since you do not seem to be listening to people's wants, and then there's no other way that they can express their views, and here is the result. I mean, even in the Hong Kong, one of the Hong Kong papers, there was a writer even suggesting that the protesters should deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, regardless of this violence. I mean, this is really ridiculous, because the rule of law, of course, is Hong Kong's anchor of stability and prosperity. And to condone this kind of violence is really undermines Hong Kong's very foundation.
Okay.
But having said that, though, there's a deep-seated kind of dissatisfaction amongst the young people, and that got to be traced back to the so-called umbrella movement a couple of years ago.
Right.
During the umbrella movement, they were demanding for universal suffrage. There was a universal suffrage package allowable under Hong Kong's constitution, the basic law.
Yeah.
But then the package wasn't regarded as liberal enough. And I think that at the heart of it all is that the people demand that they should have a more freedom, a more liberal way to elect the chief executive which they prefer, rather than candidates handpicked by Beijing. But herein lies the contradictions of the one country, two system,
Right.
because these are the safeguards for the one country.
Okay. Fred Teng, you know, talking about dissatisfaction in Hong Kong, and as we've just heard from Andrew, there are a lot of grievances there, but some of the protesters claim that they're not being listened to. This is what one of the protesters had to say. Let's listen to him.
I understand people in Hong Kong or around the world might not 100% agree or disagree on all of the behavior of protesters. But when more than 25% of the population, those more than 2 million people, joined the rally already, but all of the requests have been ignored. So is there any way out?
So Carrie Lam has promised that the government will change its approach to ensure that more voices are heard. Do you think that's going to work?
I think Hong Kong as a city have to actually do more consultation with its citizens wherever they propose any laws or changes than even in the modern United States. But if people want to be heard, I think that besides protesting, they should join the government, work in the government, run for office. There are many, many routes to do such things. But creating violence and taking over a legislative hall universally is not. Nobody can agree to that. I don't think the United States will allow people to take over the Congress and to vandalize it that way either. So I think that those actions are totally wrong. But Hong Kong's future needs to be decided by the Hong Kong people, which including certainly the protesters, but as well as the government leaders, business leaders, the parents, the teachers, and including the people who are silent right now. Maintaining silence is not a good way. Everybody needs to speak up and talk about a future of Hong Kong that they want to see.
Qinduo Xu, there has been strong criticism from China over remarks that have been made by the British Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. He's been talking about support for Hong Kong and its freedoms. The Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom had something to say about that. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We all remember what Hong Kong was 22 years ago under British rule. There's no freedom, democracy, whatever. We all know that all governors were appointed by the British government. People have no right to elect its officials, no right to demonstrate, certainly, and they do not even have a right to have independent judicial power.
So that was the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom there. But Qinduo Xu, what is your view of Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, weighing in on what China believes is a domestic issue?
Well, that's about the 1984, the joint declaration between the Chinese side and the British side in the time leading up to the 1997 handover. So basically, it says, during the time between 1984 to 1997, so the time leading up to the ceremony, so the Hong Kong affairs will be administered by the British side. And after that, China will resume its sovereignty of Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be established, and they will be in charge of the Hong Kong affairs. And also, China, is committed to the one country, two system, the formula that will remain unchanged for 50 years. Basically, that's all the content. And so it's like the declaration when the handover is finished. So from the Chinese point of view, yeah, that's a historical, important piece of documents, but that's the past. But for the British side, especially Jeremy Hunt, when he made the remarks about basically siding with the protesters, even when they stormed the legislature, that is something very hard for the Chinese side to understand and to accept. Basically, it's like you are stirring more protest and more trouble for Hong Kong. So that's one of the key points the two sides have a problem with it.
Right, Nathan, does the Chinese ambassador have a point there? Because, countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, for that matter, are constantly complaining about interference, meddling in its internal affairs.
I mean, as a Brit, this is kind of ridiculous. I mean, look, I may get in trouble for saying this, but the British media coverage of what's been going on in Hong Kong has been incredibly intense. It's been leading their bulletins for a huge amount of time, a huge interest in the protesters, whether it turns to violence or not. And you can understand that. It's a sort of post-colonial mindset. There is this feeling in the UK that Hong Kong would have been better if it stayed with the British. And you can feel that through the media. You can feel that through the political classes. Let's just set the record straight here. How did Hong Kong fall into the hands of the British? Did it just sort of, no. It was the Opium Wars, basically prying open the Qing dynasty to sell a drug and get people addicted, which is what, and the defeat of the Qing dynasty, which led to the Hong Kong lease. And you can't separate. If the UK is going to sort of insert itself into the affairs of Hong Kong now, you can't separate the history. It's quite incredible to me that you have this sort of imperial hangover. And this is, from a Brit who grew up during the handover. Having said that, there are economic ties. There are strong links. And the UK feels, and also the UK is going through an incredible process right now where it's withdrawing from the European Union, it's having problems with the Trump administration here in Washington and wants to be a global power again. So it does think about Hong Kong, but it's really going to have to make a choice, I think. If it continues to speak up, and if Jeremy Hunt becomes Prime Minister, which is terribly unlikely, but also Boris Johnson does not have different views on this, is that really, are they going to annoy Beijing by inserting themselves into Hong Kong affairs when they're looking for trading relationships beyond the EU and using Beijing as a counterweight to get a better deal with Washington? I mean, very short-sighted. Anyway, that's just my view. I'm going to get in trouble, I know.
All right, Andrew, getting back to what's going on in Hong Kong, what kind of pressure is Carrie Lam under right now to get this situation under control?
Well, she's under tremendous pressure. I mean, immediately after this saga, she was in hiding almost for almost a week. And then she only recently came out to explain, to formally respond to the so-called 5 demands of the protesters, including saying that the bill is dead and then also offering to meet the students in an open forum. But I think there are speculations that she may already, tendering her resignation or something like that. But I myself don't believe in that because It's not for her to say whether she would continue with the job.
Right.
It's Beijing's authority. But also, if you look around, there are who is in a better position to hold the job more effectively than her in these circumstances.
Right.
So I think that the likelihood is that she would be allowed time to clean up this mess, this political mess, and to concentrate on livelihood issues, at least for the remainder of her term. As to whether or not there's going to be a second term, well, of course, this is a moot point.
Okay.
And there is three more years to go.
All right, Fred Teng, there are local elections coming up in Hong Kong later this year. Could they be another flashpoint for these protests?
Usually, this type of protest, the kind of social unrest, will create a negative effect for the opposition, which is the pandemic side. Whenever they have such movements, a lot of the people are turned off by it. Rather than the people come on the streets and demonstrate, there are a lot more people who are staying at home and does not agree with their actions. So usually usually there will be a negative effect. And I was in Hong Kong on the Tuesday night at the dinner with Carrie Lam. She spoke very eloquently. She articulated issues. I think that she is a very good professional government worker, and she's trying to look at the Hong Kong's overall future in mind rather than taking responsibility or taking credit whether this bill passed or not. I think that this bill is being on hold while the process is dead, but there could be another new process in the future to restart this again.
All right, Qinduo Xu, what is your view on that? What do these protests mean for the future of Hong Kong? Could we see more protests, or is it going to take some kind of political reform to resolve it?
I think it could be also opportunity. Of course, she is under tremendous pressure, first of all, to resolve this crisis, which is sort of going on. To add to that point, I would say, some of the protesters, at least, they are demanding basically, withdraw the bill, punish those police who use forces, and then amnesty for those who broke the law, the protesters.
Right.
They are like spoiled kids. If you don't agree with me, don't give me the candy, I will cry and cry. This is going extreme. I think the government should be doing the right thing, even under pressure.
Okay.
Qinduo raises a good point. In talking to a lot of my colleagues in Beijing or Chengdu or whatever, they see Hong Kong, like, why are they acting like this? They're spoiled. We give them everything. and I just want to add one final point about Washington. Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump, has been very silent about Hong Kong.
Right.
But behind the scenes, actually, that's not been the case with his administration. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, exactly, and others have really sort of been blowing on the embers of the flames here, including meeting with democracy activists, people who would not normally get access to the administration at this time. And I think that's something to watch in the coming days and weeks.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.